The first thing you should know is that I didn't plan to humiliate my daughter-in-law in public, but when the moment came, it wasn't rage that guided me, it was clarity. We were seated around a table draped in crisp white linen. The glow from the chandelier spilling across wine glasses filled just enough to look expensive. Melissa was in her element, her nails freshly done, her voice the loudest in the room, her smile wide enough to make everyone think she was charming. She'd been talking all evening, tossing little comments my way like darts. Most people would have brushed them off as harmless jokes. I didn't. Not after everything I knew. Not after what I'd uncovered. Then, with perfect timing and the kind of confidence you only get when you think you own the room, she leaned back in her chair, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "What's it like being a failure?" It landed like a slap. A few people gasped quietly, but most just laughed, the kind of laughter that spreads when people are too afraid not to join in. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I simply leaned forward, my voice steady and cold enough to cut through the noise. "What's it like knowing this failure won't fund your lifestyle anymore?" The sound drained out of the room. Glasses paused midair. Melissa's smirk faltered just slightly, but I saw it. I saw her eyes shift, searching for control she suddenly didn't have. Freeze that moment. Hold it there. Because what you're seeing isn't a spontaneous outburst. It's the final step in a plan that began long before this dinner, long before the insults, long before she ever thought she could outplay me. And the truth? It all started the moment I realized my own son had chosen her side. If this is your first time coming across one of our stories, welcome. Please hit the like button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And don't scroll away, because what happened next no one saw coming. And if you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. I'm Linda, 58 years old, widowed for just over a decade. Every wrinkle on my face, every line on my hands, I earned them building a life from scratch. I've never been wealthy in the way some people measure it, but my small business kept a roof over our heads, paid for my son's education, and let me sleep at night knowing I owed no one a dime. David is my only child, 32 years old now. As a boy, he was full of curiosity, the kind of kid who'd ask 100 questions before breakfast. As a man, he's charming, the kind of smile that wins people over in seconds, but he has a tendency to take the easier path, even if it means letting someone else steer the ship. Melissa came into our lives 3 years ago. She's 30, sharp-tongued, and knows how to walk into a room like she owns it. Her hair is always styled to perfection, her clothes carefully chosen, her phone constantly in her hand as if the next text might determine her place in the world. She speaks in compliments that somehow leave you feeling smaller, and she thrives on being seen. My sister, Carol, is my anchor. She's 2 years younger than me but carries herself like the older sibling, protective, blunt, and incapable of pretending she likes someone she doesn't. Her daughter, Emily, is my niece but might as well be my own. She's 25, putting herself through graduate school, and the kind of person who'd show up at your door with soup just because you sounded tired on the phone. Before Melissa, our family gatherings were the kind people envied, Sunday dinners with laughter spilling from the kitchen, recipes passed down through generations, and a table where everyone felt welcome. No one worried about the price of the wine, or whether the plates matched. It was about showing up and being together. That changed slowly. At first, Melissa's comments seemed harmless enough. "Oh, Linda, you still have that couch? It's so vintage." Or, "You don't use delivery apps? That's so old-fashioned." She'd laugh lightly, like it was all in fun, but the words lingered, small reminders that she saw me as something quaint and outdated. The first real crack showed up on my grandson's birthday. I had picked out a gift that meant something, a wooden train set like the one David had loved as a boy. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid, the kind of toy that could be passed down. After the cake was cut, I went into the kitchen to refill the coffee pot, and that's when I heard her voice. "She bought him that? I mean, it's sweet, but you'd think she could splurge a little. It's his birthday, not a garage sale." Her friend laughed, and I heard the sound of wine being poured. I stood there, my hands tightening around the coffee pot handle, my cheeks burning. For a moment, I thought about walking in and confronting her, but instead I stayed still, listening to the way she lowered her voice and said, "David's mom means well. She's just not wealthy enough to matter. It took everything in me to keep my face neutral when I walked back out into the living room. David caught my eye, but I didn't say a word. Later, when I finally brought it up, his response was quick, almost rehearsed. Mom, you're overthinking it. Melissa doesn't mean anything by it. But I knew better. People don't casually question your worth unless they believe it. And Melissa believed it. What I didn't realize then was just how far she'd go to make sure the rest of the family believed it too. It started with the cancellations. David and I had a tradition. Saturday morning breakfast at the little diner on Main Street. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. We'd sit in the same booth, order the same coffee, and talk about everything from sports to work to whatever book I was reading. But after Melissa came along, the excuses began to stack up. Melissa's not feeling well. We've got an early appointment. She already made plans for us. At first, I tried to be understanding. Life changes after marriage. Schedules get busier. But as the weeks turned into months, the invitations stopped altogether. I'd suggest a date, and David's voice would take on this faintly apologetic tone. Sorry, Mom, we're swamped right now. Always we, never he. When we did see each other, there was a subtle shift in him. He still smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. His responses were shorter. Conversations that used to stretch for hours now ended after 10 minutes because Melissa's waiting. At family gatherings, Melissa took the center of the room without asking. She told stories with sweeping hand gestures, laughing loudly, her eyes scanning to make sure everyone was watching. If I spoke up to share something, she'd wait for a pause and then jump in with something bigger, flashier. She had a knack for weaving her own success into every conversation. The new designer bag she'd found, the luxury restaurant they'd tried, the exclusive event they'd been invited to. And little by little, I began to notice how my contributions, the small, thoughtful touches, faded into the background. I'd bring a homemade pie to dinner, and she'd present a 3-tier cake from a trendy bakery, wrapped in gold ribbon. I'd set the table with my mother's china, and she'd arrive with an expensive floral arrangement that somehow became the centerpiece. People oohed and awed over her gestures while mine became footnotes. It wasn't just about the gestures themselves. It was the way she looked at me when they happened. A quick glance, almost like she was silently saying, "See? This is how it's done." Then came the moment that set my instincts on high alert. We were at my house for a small Sunday lunch, just a few relatives and close friends. I was refilling drinks when Melissa, standing in the kitchen doorway, mentioned casually to Carol, "Oh, I've been helping with the business books lately. Just making sure everything's running smoothly for Linda." My hands froze over the picture. I hadn't asked her to touch my business records. In fact, I hadn't even discussed them with her. I kept my face neutral and let her finish the conversation, but my mind was already spinning. Why was she in my books at all? The lunch went on, laughter and chatter filling the room, but I barely heard it. My attention kept circling back to that one sentence, the way she delivered it so casually, as if it was already a done deal. And as I cleared the dishes that night, one thought kept pressing in like a shadow over everything else. Melissa wasn't just trying to outshine me. She was positioning herself to take control. It began with numbers that didn't quite add up. At first, they were small, a payment log twice, a deposit that showed up a few days later than it should have. I chalked it up to clerical error. I'd been running the business for decades, and mistakes happen from time to time. But as I flipped through the records late one night, I noticed the pattern. The discrepancies were all in areas Melissa would have had access to if she'd been helping with the books like she claimed. When I brought it up casually to David, he brushed it aside with that same easy charm. "Melissa's just trying to make things easier for you, Mom. You've worked so hard. Maybe it's time to take a step back." The next week, Melissa stopped by for lunch. She breezed into the kitchen carrying store-bought salads and chattered about the weather, her phone in one hand, tapping the screen between bites. Midway through the meal, she leaned back in her chair and said it as if it were the most natural suggestion in the world. "You know, Linda, you've earned your rest. Why not retire early? Hand the business over to David, so you can finally relax. He can handle the modern side of things, and I could help him with the accounts." I didn't respond right away. I just stirred my tea and let the silence stretch. But in my head, the words for my own good twisted into something else entirely, for her benefit. A week later, I hosted a small lunch at my house for a few friends and neighbors. We were seated around the table, sharing stories, when Melissa turned to one of the women and with a laugh said, "Linda doesn't really get how money works today. She's old school. Still writes checks for bills." The table chuckled politely, but I caught Carol's eyes across the room, sharp, knowing. That wasn't a harmless joke. That was a seed, planted for others to hear. Later that afternoon, while clearing plates, I passed by the hallway and heard voices coming from the back porch. David's was low, Melissa's just a little sharper. "When she steps down," Melissa was saying, "we'll have to figure out what to liquidate first. The house alone could." I didn't hear the rest. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, but I forced myself to keep walking toward the sink. That night, I took out a notebook from the bottom drawer of my desk, a plain spiral-bound one I usually kept for grocery lists. On the first page, I wrote the date and every detail I could remember from the past month. The comments, the suggestions, the numbers in the accounts, the overheard conversation. This wasn't paranoia. This was evidence, a trail I might one day need, and as the pages began to fill, I realized something that made my hands go still over the pen. Melissa wasn't waiting for me to step aside. She was preparing to push me out. It was Carol who finally said the words out loud. We were sitting on her porch, late afternoon sunlight catching the rim of her coffee mug, when she leaned in just slightly and lowered her voice. "Linda, you need to know something. Melissa's been talking. At a luncheon last week, she told a couple of women from church that you're planning to leave the house to David, and that it'll be there soon." She said it like it was already decided. The air seemed to tighten around me. I gripped the mug a little harder, the warmth suddenly uncomfortable in my hands. Carol wasn't one for gossip. If she was saying this, she'd heard it clearly, and from more than one source. That night, after turning the key in my front door and standing in the stillness of my empty living room, I made a decision. I couldn't just sit back and wait to see what would happen. I needed facts. Not whispers. Not suspicions. Proof. The next morning I met with an attorney I trusted, a man named Richard who had handled my business paperwork years ago, when I'd first expanded. He was discreet, efficient, and had no ties to David or Melissa. I explained the situation without embellishment, laying out the oddities in the accounts, the overheard conversations, and now Carol's warning. Richard's eyes sharpened. "If she's touched business funds without authorization, we'll find it." It took less than 2 weeks for him to call me back. When I sat down in his office, the manila folder on the desk between us felt heavier than paper should. He started reading off the list. 5 designer handbags, all purchased within 6 months, total value in the thousands. Multiple charges to high-end spas, single-day packages that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And then the one that made my stomach twist, a sizable payment to a luxury car dealership. Not for a lease, not for a down payment on a practical family vehicle, but for a gleaming, imported sports model that Melissa had been showing off on social media. Every transaction had been run through the business account, and every single one bore David's electronic approval. I stared at the papers, the neat columns of figures, the tidy confirmation signatures. My son's name was on all of them. The betrayal hit me in 2 waves. First hers, the boldness of taking what she hadn't earned. And then his, the choice to protect her instead of respecting me. He hadn't just stood by, he'd participated. I closed the folder, slid it back across the desk, and thanked Richard for his time. My voice was steady, but inside, something had shifted. There was no going back to how things had been. And if they thought I was going to sit quietly while they prepared to carve up my life, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. "I need you to breathe." I wasn't ready for that twist either. If your heart just dropped, tap the like button. It tells me I'm not the only one who felt it. And don't keep this story to yourself. Share it with someone who loves real-life drama as much as you do. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. From the outside, you wouldn't have known anything had shifted. I still showed up to family dinners, wearing the same easy smile. I asked about their vacations, about the latest restaurant they'd tried. I complimented Melissa on her new dress, her shoes, the very ones I knew had been paid for with stolen funds. I even wrote the occasional check for household expenses, knowing full well it was being funneled into their curated lifestyle. It wasn't kindness. It was camouflage. Every moment I played the part of the accommodating mother and mother-in-law. I was buying time. Time to put everything in place without them suspecting a thing. Richard became my quiet partner in the process. We met in his office twice a week, working after hours so there would be no chance of David or Melissa seeing my car parked nearby. Piece by piece, we dismantled their access to my life. The first step was the business. The accounts were restructured, and the signature requirements changed so that no one, not David, not Melissa, could authorize a single transaction without my explicit approval. We moved large reserves into certificates of deposit under my name only, the kind that couldn't be touched without personal identification and in-person authorization. Then came the assets. The house, the lake cabin, and a small rental property I'd held onto for years were quietly transferred into a private trust. The beneficiary? Emily, my niece, the one person I trusted to understand both the history and the value of what I'd built. She didn't know it yet. That would come later. I contacted my insurance agent and rewrote my policies. Life, property, even the business coverage. All of them were scrubbed clean of David and Melissa's names. My retirement accounts were adjusted, my will rewritten. Every loose thread tied down. But it wasn't just about protection, it was about control. I began to slowly turn off the faucet they'd been drinking from. Not all at once, that would have drawn suspicion. Instead, the help I gave became slightly less frequent. The checks were smaller, sometimes delayed. I let their calls about unexpected expenses go to voicemail. If they noticed, they didn't let on. Melissa was still posting pictures of weekend getaways, spa appointments, and that shiny sports car, which told me they believed the gravy train was still running. And through it all, I never faltered in my performance. At birthdays, I brought thoughtful gifts. At Sunday lunches, I asked Melissa about her work projects. I laughed at David's recycled jokes, even when my heart clenched at the memory of the boy he used to be. Because the truth was, my silence wasn't weakness. It was the sharpest blade I had. And when the moment came to use it, I wanted it to cut clean and deep. They thought they were playing me. But the game had shifted. And I was the one setting the rules. The invitation arrived in a thick cream-colored envelope, the kind you'd expect for a wedding or a black tie gala. Gold foil edging, embossed lettering, and a swirling script that announced a celebration of family and the future. It was signed in both their names, but the tone, that was pure Melissa. The language dripped with self-importance. Every word chosen to signal status and exclusivity. RSVP was required. And the location was a high-end restaurant downtown, one that boasted a months-long waitlist for reservations. I didn't need to ask what this was about. Melissa didn't host events to celebrate family. She hosted them to showcase herself. And this was her victory lap. In her mind, she had the family under her influence, the business within reach, and my son bound to her vision of wealth and success. This dinner would be her way of cementing her dominance. A public statement of who held the reins. But she had no idea she'd been riding a horse that wasn't hers to command. I RSVP'd, yes, of course. I would never miss it. But this wasn't about showing up to be polite. This was about timing. This was about choosing the exact moment to shift the air in the room. To let the weight of truth fall like a stone into still water. In the days leading up to the dinner, I rehearsed my words. Not angry words, not defensive. Calm. Unshakable. A tone that could not be dismissed as emotional or petty. I knew Melissa's tactics. She twisted, exaggerated, reframed every uncomfortable truth. But facts, stated plainly, would leave her nowhere to go. I imagined the scene, her basking in the glow of her own performance, showing off a new dress, maybe dropping hints about future plans that involved what she believed to be her inheritance. I would wait until she had built herself up to the highest point in the evening. Until her confidence filled the room so fully she couldn't imagine it deflating. And then, I would remove the air. The night before, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and looked myself in the eyes. I didn't look like someone plotting revenge. I looked like someone who had simply decided that enough was enough. Decided that the person in control of my life was me, and me alone. I thought of Emily, of Carol, of the people who loved me without strings. I thought of the years I had spent earning every dollar, every property, every scrap of stability. And I thought of Melissa, assuming she could waltz in and claim it as her own. She believed this dinner would be the beginning of her reign. I knew it would be the end. The restaurant's private dining room glowed under soft amber lights, the kind meant to flatter every face and make every glass of wine look richer. The long mahogany table was dressed with white linen, flickering candles, and small vases of fresh roses. A pianist in the corner played something smooth and unintrusive, just loud enough to make the room feel expensive. Melissa was in her element. She floated from guest to guest before the meal, air-kissing cheeks, making introductions that placed her firmly at the center of every interaction. Her dress was new, designer no doubt, its deep emerald fabric catching the light every time she turned. She wore it like armor, each shimmer reinforcing her belief that she was untouchable. David stood beside her, smiling in that practiced way he had developed since their marriage, nodding when she spoke, chiming in when needed, but never steering the conversation. He had become her echo, her shadow. I took my seat halfway down the table, close enough to observe without being directly in her spotlight. The wine was poured, plates were set, and Melissa began her performance. She dominated the room with stories about their latest investments, about travel plans that dripped with luxury, about how running a business these days required vision that some people just didn't have anymore. Her eyes slid toward me with each subtle jab, her lips curling ever so slightly when polite chuckles rippled around the table. I smiled faintly and sipped my water. The courses came and went, artisanal bread, chilled salad, roasted lamb with rosemary juice. Through it all, Melissa maintained control of the conversation, her voice weaving through topics that allowed her to display her wealth, her taste, her supposed business acumen. Every so often a veiled insult floated my way. Some people think hanging on to old methods is a virtue, but really it's just resistance to progress. Or, you can't build a legacy if you're afraid to take risks. Guests laughed, though some cast glances at me, unsure whether to join in. I stayed composed, letting the words pass over me as though they were no more than passing smoke. Then came dessert chocolate souffle with a dusting of powdered sugar. Melissa leaned back in her chair, fork poised, and looked straight at me. Her voice was light, casual, but her eyes were sharp. "So Linda," she said, "what's it like being a failure?" The laughter was immediate, loud, and almost relieved, as though everyone had been waiting for the punchline that would finally burst the tension. It rang around the table, bouncing off polished wood and glassware. I didn't laugh. I set my fork down gently, the silver making the faintest sound against the china. I leaned forward just slightly, enough to close the space between us without raising my voice. "What's it like?" I said evenly, "knowing this failure won't fund your lifestyle anymore?" The laughter died instantly, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. You could hear the pianist's fingers still moving in the distance, the faint clink of cutlery from another room, the sharp inhale from someone 2 seats away. Melissa froze. Her confident smile faltered, her eyes flickering with confusion, then disbelief. I didn't break eye contact. "The business you've been spending from? It's no longer yours to inherit. The house you've been picturing yourself redecorating? It's in a trust now, one you'll never touch. The spa trips, the handbags, the car payments? They won't be covered anymore. Not by me." Whispers spread down the table like a current, guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. David's face drained of color. Melissa's chair scraped back suddenly, the legs shrieking against the hardwood. Without a word, she stood, grabbed her clutch, and walked out. David hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the door, then followed her, his footsteps quick and uneven. The door closed behind them, leaving the rest of the table in stunned silence. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else reached for their wine glass. The pianist kept playing, oblivious. I sat back, folded my hands, and let the silence do the rest. The room felt strangely larger once they were gone, as if their absence had pulled the tension straight out of the air. Conversations resumed in small, tentative bursts, some guests speaking in hushed tones while others avoided my gaze altogether. Carol, seated 2 places down, caught my eye. She didn't say a word, she didn't need to. Her slow, deliberate nod was enough to tell me she understood everything. From the years of subtle disrespect to the quiet work I'd done to protect what was mine. I remained at the table for another 20 minutes, answering the occasional polite question, listening to the clink of cutlery, and offering small, composed smiles when someone glanced my way. I didn't elaborate, didn't defend myself, didn't indulge curiosity. The truth was already set in motion. It no longer needed my voice to carry it. When dessert plates were cleared and coffee was served, I excused myself with calm civility, as though nothing monumental had just taken place. My coat slid over my shoulders, my bag rested comfortably on my arm, and I walked out of the restaurant into the crisp night air. The valet brought my car around, and as I slid into the driver's seat, I noticed how still my hands felt. No shaking, no adrenaline tremors. Just a steady, measured quiet inside me. The drive home was peaceful, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of passing streetlights soothing in a way I hadn't expected. My thoughts didn't dwell on their faces, or their likely conversations in the car they had taken. Instead, I found myself replaying the look in Melissa's eyes when the balance of power shifted, when she realized the empire she had been waiting to inherit had never belonged to her at all. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light spilled over the familiar steps, casting the same warm glow it always had. Inside, the house was silent, the kind of silence that felt protective, not lonely. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and exhaled slowly. The weight I'd been carrying for months, maybe years, had loosened its grip. Morning came without a single message from David or Melissa. The phone sat idle on the counter, no calls, no texts, no feigned concern. I went about my day as though nothing had changed, but everything had. The business was secure. My home was untouchable. My financial ties to them were severed. For the first time in a long while, I moved through my schedule without wondering what they might be plotting. By the third day, the silence began to shift into whispers. Not to me directly, but through the inevitable channels family drama travels. Carol mentioned that Melissa had been venting, to anyone who would listen, painting herself as the wronged party, claiming I had acted out of jealousy or spite. David, apparently, was quieter, avoiding gatherings, perhaps out of embarrassment or a dawning realization of just how much he had enabled. I didn't correct their narratives. I didn't counter their stories. I didn't need to. The truth, like water, finds its way through cracks. And those who knew me well enough had already seen the truth for themselves. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the final stroke of my revenge, the understanding that my peace was no longer tied to their approval, or their presence in my life. That night, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the air cool against my skin, I thought about how easily a life can be eroded by small, constant cuts, and how quietly it can be rebuilt when you refuse to let those cuts define you. The world beyond my fence line moved on, but here, in this space I had fought to protect, everything was exactly as it should be. Weeks passed before their names lit up my phone screen. At first, it was David, his tone overly casual, pretending as though our last encounter had been nothing more than a tense family disagreement. He spoke of misunderstandings and hurt feelings, without ever naming the choices that had led us here. Then Melissa tried. Her voice softened into something almost sweet, yet every word was wrapped in careful calculation. She hinted at second chances, at moving forward, as if the past could be swept clean without acknowledgement or accountability. I didn't refuse their calls outright, but I made no effort to close the distance they had created. My words were polite, clipped, and deliberate. I offered no openings for reconciliation on their terms. There would be no reinstatement of the allowances, no return of access to accounts, no quiet rescinding of the changes I had made. Each conversation ended the same way, civil but final, as if the door between us had been locked and bolted from my side. Soon, the ripples began to show. Their once flashy lifestyle started to thin at the edges. The second car Melissa had flaunted was listed for sale online. The expensive handbags that had once been part of her curated image appeared in consignment shops. Their social media feeds, once filled with weekend getaways and high-end dinners, became quieter, the curated perfection giving way to a more ordinary life. No more champagne brunches overlooking city skylines, no more resort selfies tagged in tropical locations. I heard bits and pieces through the same channels that had carried their boasts months earlier. They were juggling bills, delaying payments, making choices they had never imagined they'd have to make. I didn't gloat, didn't laugh, didn't allow myself the satisfaction of outward celebration. My revenge was never about public humiliation. It was about reclaiming what was mine and ensuring they could no longer use me as their safety net. With my days no longer weighed down by their demands, I turned my attention inward. I booked a trip I'd been postponing for years, an autumn journey through the New England countryside, just in time for the leaves to blaze gold and crimson. I walked through my home with fresh eyes, making quiet upgrades. A new reading nook by the window, a kitchen renovation I dreamed of but never prioritized. Most importantly, I poured into Emily's future. I sat with her over coffee and mapped out her college plans, transferring funds into her education account with a sense of deep satisfaction. Investing in her wasn't just about money, it was about choosing someone who valued effort, respect, and gratitude. Each week that passed without their laughter in my home, without their presence at my table, reminded me that peace was not something they could take from me, it was something I had built for myself. And in that peace, I finally understood the difference between losing people and freeing yourself from them. One late afternoon I sat on my porch, the wood warm beneath my feet, a cup of chamomile tea cradled in my hands. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and rose, the kind of quiet beauty you only notice when your life isn't clouded with noise you didn't invite in. I thought back to that dinner, to the word Melissa had thrown across the table like a dart. Failure. It had landed then, sharp and cutting, but now it seemed almost absurd in the light of what I had reclaimed. Failure, I realized, is a word the selfish wield when they can't control someone anymore. They measure worth in what they can take from you, not in what you have built, protected, or survived. In their eyes, you're only successful if you're serving their needs. And the moment you stop, they rename you. But the truth is simpler, some of us are not failures at all. We are the strongest people in the room precisely because we refuse to be used. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in my chest, feeling no need for applause, no desire for vindication. The silence around me wasn't lonely, it was earned. My porch, my home, my life, they were mine again. And I would protect them without hesitation. And that was how I took back my power without raising my voice. If this ending gave you chills or left you speechless, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because my next story might just be even wilder. And please drop a comment below. I read every single one.